Why don't you give it to me? Heaven is here. Why don't you give it to me? Heaven is here.
Good morning. Please take a seat if you are not already seated. We are about to get started, so welcome everybody to this morning's session, where we are going to talk about crime in sport. Well, as we have heard already yesterday, when we speak about integrity in sport, we usually talk about things connected to athletes, to sports, on the field of play, influencing results and medals, such as doping, match fixing, even sexual harassment, as we heard last night. But sport is also about money, and where there's money, there's crime. And this is what we're going to look at this morning from various perspectives with a very interesting and diverse set of speakers. We all know that international sports federations are autonomous organizations, but they are also part of society. And investigating and prosecuting international organizations, whether it's sport or other kind of organization, international crime in itself is a challenge. We'll hear from various speakers how to tackle those challenges. We also will take a look at the problem of those kind of crime that can be part of sport, such as corruption and other financial crimes. And the first speaker I'd like to welcome is Professor Stefano Caneppele from the University in Lausanne, who will speak to us now. Please, Stefano.
So, thank you, Mr. Larsen. Thank you for the invitation to this event. This is the first time that I joined the Play the Game conference. I don't know very much the environment. I know there is only one rule, to stay within 10 minutes. So I will try to stay in 10 minutes my presentation. I'm a criminologist from University of Lausanne and professor there. I hold an academic course focused on sport, crime and integrity in the Master of Law in Criminology and Security at the University of Lausanne. My main research topics focus on organized crime, economic crime and crime prevention. I'm also part of the platform on sport that the University of Lausanne have created last year. I'm also part of the School of Criminal Justice, which was founded by Rudolf Archibald Rice in 1909, and it is one among the oldest, if not the oldest, forensic institute in the world. Today, more than 100 people, professors, research assistants, researchers, PhD candidates, are working there, combining together forensic science and criminology. And like many others in and outside the academia, we are trying to ride the waves of change, which, by the way, is the topic of this conference. Just think, for example, about how many challenges the police have to deal with the advent of the internet, about how the way of carrying out police investigation has changed, and how much social networks like Facebook, for example, have been used by criminals to make illicit arrangements or to establish contacts with players. Of course, social networks are also a source of information, and that's why one of the waves of change goes through what we call open source intelligence. Put simply, open source intelligence is intelligence collecting from publicly available sources. In other words, we can improve the understanding of the phenomena just combining existing pieces of information which are dispersed on the internet. As a scientific partner of Interpol, my colleagues are doing this through the Energia project, looking at the forum and at the websites which sell enhancing performing drugs. For the Council of Europe, as scientific advisor, we are instead looking at the phenomenon of corruption with the aim of creating the DACCS, a database, an alleged case of corruption in sport. In this phase, we used a large definition of corruption. The DACCS is still in a pilot phase, but its idea is to gather a large set of cases in order to detect cases of corruption and fraud in sport around the world, and to monitor whether the case ended without any action or whether disciplinary action has been taken and its outcome, or a criminal investigation has been taken and its outcome. We know that one of the big challenges is to achieve conviction. It's very difficult to make international investigation, and we think that this database will get some insights about the hurdles that these kind of activities are in place. The project, starting in spring 2017 with the first data collection exercise, we are now in the phase of refining the best methodology capable of covering the maximum number of cases. The first consolidated version should be ready by the end of 2018, and I'm now providing you some preliminary results of the first exercise, which should be considered as a feasibility test. The results prove that through a systematic data collection, it is possible to establish a corruption database on sport cases. In the first round, we collected 67 cases reported by the media in 2016. 114 countries were involved. 1/3 of cases involved 2 or more countries, and around 140 people were involved. The most frequent cases were related to contracts, illicit activity related to contracts, match fixing, and event bids. The most touched sport was football, tennis, and athletics, with no surprise. Almost 75% of cases have been touched by disciplinary action, 50% by criminal investigation. We do not have the result of the most criminal investigations, since most of the cases are still ongoing. But the hypothesis that we made about the fact that corruption and fraud in sport in general are clustered, it seems confirmed. Corruption and fraud are opportunity-driven and cluster around certain sports, football, tennis, athletics, for example, around main sport events, around sport bodies with excessive power concentration, with lack of term limits, lack of financial auditing, then poor governance. And this is important because this would allow us to analyze data in order to detect further patterns. Our effort is trying to provide a taxonomy of corruption and fraud in sport, which is led by data. According to previous scholar, we distinguished between on-field and off-field behaviors. The first have a direct impact on the sport results, while the others may impact on the adjudication, preparation, and management of sport events, or on the appointments and management of sport bodies. Contrary to other data collection exercises that have already been done in the past and which were based on individual initiative, the DACCS seems more promising for one reason. It is promoted by the Council of Europe through the enlarged partial agreement on sport, and this may assure continuity in the long run. We can imagine that we make an estimation about 150, 200 cases per year. Then if we go in a 10-year, we can have a database with 2,000 cases to be analyzed. So eventually, the DACCS initiative may be the opportunity to develop a research agenda which will allow us to answer to this question. What are the typologies of corruption and fraud in sport and their modus operandi? Where corruption is most present? What are the factors that facilitate corruption in sport? Who are the authors and victims in the different typologies? What are their characteristics? What measures work and what do not in tackling corruption and fraud in sport? As academic, our role is not to take decisions, but to provide pieces of knowledge to policy and decision makers in order to give them the opportunity to take informed decisions. I believe that the DACCS may become a good platform for this, and I hope to be there in 2 years and to share with you the results and some pieces of answer to the question above. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefano. We will wait with questions and answers till a little bit later, but I would now like to invite our next speaker, who is a veteran of several Play the Game conferences, Mr. Arnout, who has been working with governance in sport for a number of years with the Sport Governance Observer, and he will now tell us if he sees any signs of progress in the governance in the world of sport. Arnout, please.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. 10 minutes. I'll keep this brief. I'm going to talk about governance reforms. I think in the past few years, and this is no secret, we have seen some very severe corruption scandals in international sports governance. And I think researchers, journalists, NGOs like Play the Game basically have two options right now. The first option is either they say, well, this world of sport is doomed, it is a rotten world, and they continue to say how bad everything is. Second option is that they accept that there perhaps are structural solutions that can mitigate corruption problems, and subsequently look into whether or not international federations are in fact implementing these solutions. Personally, I like the second option better. And that's because we know from other sectors, from the literature, from practical examples, that implementing good governance decreases corruption risks. It will never completely eradicate corruption, but it will decrease corruption risks. Implementing transparency, implementing democracy, implementing internal accountability and control decreases the likelihood of corruption. Now, if we know that, the question then is, do international sport federations implement these dimensions of good governance? 2 years ago, I did a survey of the 35 international Olympic sport federations. I looked into exactly these dimensions of good governance, and I found that more than 70%, I think 75%, achieve a good governance score of less than 50 out of 100. Yeah? In a recent survey conducted by the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations, it was found that about half of the Summer Olympic federations achieve mediocre to weak scores on good governance. Now, does that mean that everything is bad? No, absolutely not. In fact, we are seeing quite a few signs of progress in this world. At the international level, there are governance reforms in international federations. Federations such as FIFA, such as the International Athletics Federation, the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations is now actively encouraging the implementation of good governance in Summer Olympic federations. The Association of Winter Olympic Federations is doing the same with Winter Olympic Federations. So these are very important signs of good progress. At the national level, we see that codes of good governance are being adopted in more and more countries, and countries are debating implementing these codes. We know that because we are working with some of their governments. Does that mean that everything will be okay now? That the problem is over? Can we just let this movement do its work and everything will be resolved? No. We know from other sectors that, and scientific evidence is quite abundant in this field, that if you really want to achieve a high standard of good governance, you need to put external pressure on organizations. And here I think there's a very important role to play for NGOs, for public actors, for states, for international organizations, for journalists, and also for the sports movement. And I think that the problem now is that it is much more difficult to identify these days where to apply the pressure. 10 years ago, it was very easy to say, well, FIFA is not transparent. I think everybody knew that FIFA was not the most transparent organization in the world back then. Now FIFA has engaged in 2 important governance reforms. So it's much more difficult to identify, well, where does this organization now need to improve? I think what we need is a nuanced assessment of these changes. We live in a nuanced reality, and that nuanced reality requires nuanced assessment. Let me give you a few examples. Let's start with FIFA. Right, FIFA, they actually implemented important governance reforms in 2011. What they did was they implemented an ethics code, an ethical commission, robust, at least on paper. And in 2016, they implemented new governance changes, among which are some very important ones. Term limits for elected officials, gender equity policies, integrity checks for candidates standing for election, annual remuneration reporting, and most recently, FIFA has overhauled its World Cup bidding process, making it more transparent and more objective. Does that mean that FIFA's problems are over, that everything is being taken care of? No. When I look at the governance of FIFA, I still see some problems that need to be addressed. And I listed just a few of them, just as an example. Take the World Cup bid procedure that is now being overhauled, that is now new. I fail to see clearly identified sustainability requirements. I find that its conflict of interest procedures that FIFA has implemented are not state-of-the-art. I think FIFA does not audit the funds that it distributes to member federations or to third parties. And perhaps most importantly, I don't see a policy for encouraging good governance in national federations, in continental federations. And in fact, if you look at the corruption problems in FIFA, you will see that many of these problems emerged from the continental federations. So where's the policy for improving governance in these continental federations? FIFA could do a little more there. So not everything is good, but not everything is bad either. Another example, the IAAF, International Athletics Federation. I think the IAAF engaged in very important reforms in 2016, implementing, amongst others, conflict of interest procedures, really robust state-of-the-art procedures there, gender equity policy, improved financial reporting, a new and improved ethical code, and now its executive board also meets regularly. Does that mean that everything is good now, that there are no problems? No. If I look at the IAAF, I still see some governance deficiencies that can be addressed. For instance, in the World Championship bid procedure, I don't see any transparent or objective procedures for allocating the World Championship. I fail to see clearly defined tasks in the statutes for the audit committee. I don't really see integrity checks for candidates standing for elections. And finally, the IAAF's General Assembly meets only once every 2 years. The smallest Belgian Flemish Sports Federation General Assembly meets once every year. So why not in the International Athletics Federation? So again, not everything is bad, not everything is good either. There's still need for some additional pressure. Now, I told you that the Association for Summer Olympic International Federations is now actively encouraging good governance. I think this is a positive process. Let's take a look at it. So what about this process? What is it doing? Well, let's start with what should an organization ideally do to make sure that its member organizations comply with good governance standards. I think you need to develop a policy that addresses 2 ideal types of organizations. You will always have organizations that are unwilling to comply with good governance standards. Federations that say term limits, that's not for us, we don't want to implement that. For those organizations, you need to monitor the implementation of good governance. You need to go and look at whether or not they are, in fact, implementing the governance principles that you put forward. Subsequently, there should be repercussions for those federations that fail to implement your principles. There should be a form of sanctions. Sanctions can take many different forms, naming or shaming, financial repercussions, suspensions, and so on and so forth. And by doing this, you incentivize those organizations that are in principle unwilling to comply anyway. But then importantly, and we tend to forget this, there are also sport federations, and I experienced this, that are very much willing to implement good governance. They want to implement good governance, but for several reasons they can't, because they don't really know what principles to implement, they don't know what these principles of good governance entail. They lack the capacity, the expertise, they lack the organizational capacity to implement good governance. For those organizations, you need a completely different policy. You don't have to sanction these federations. What you need to do is explain good governance principles, build their capacity, offer them consulting, one-on-one advice, exchange of best practices, and so forth, and perhaps even give some financial support. So we know this. This is a framework that is applicable to all organizations. The question is then, does the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations actually implement these mechanisms? Let's start with positive news. For those federations that are, in principle, enabled to implement good governance, I think ASOIF has implemented some very, very good, high-standard policies. ASOIF engages in capacity building, explaining principles. It gives one-on-one advice, it distributes best practices, it organizes workshops. There is an external consultant that meets with all the federations. And ASOIF, I think, from the interviews that I conducted with federations and also with ASOIF members, I know that they really try to persuade international federations to implement good governance. So that's positive, that's very good, that's positive progress. Now, for those federations that are unwilling to implement good governance, will ASOIF's policies work? ASOIF is monitoring whether or not its member federations are implementing good governance standards, and that's very good. The problem here is that there are no real repercussions for not implementing good governance standards. There are no sanctions. And to be fair to ASOIF, ASOIF does not have the authority to implement financial sanctions. One thing it perhaps could do is just publish the scores. Publish the scores. Those federations that achieve weak scores, their scores will be published. They will face reputational costs, and this will provide an incentive to do better. So again, here, some very positive elements, but also room for improvement. Yeah, okay. So what about good governance in national federations? I won't go into that, because we discussed that yesterday, but if you want to learn more about that, our report has been published now on Play the Game's website. Let me jump to the conclusion. I think that effective governance reforms, they really depend on external pressure, and there is a role to play here for NGOs, for journalists, for researchers, and we see that good governance movements only work when these actors reinforce one another. The problem is that it is now much more difficult to know where to apply pressure. What we need are nuanced assessments of governance reforms. Not everything is bad in international sports governance, but not everything is good either, and we know where the weaknesses are so as to know where to apply pressure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arnout, and I'm sorry I had to give you the yellow card, but you can be happy that I didn't have to show you the red card. This is only if speakers speak way too long. Anyway, thank you very much. And our next speaker is not only, I would say, not only himself, but he's also representative of a trend where we see that sometimes what we do, I've been a sports administrator for 30 years, and I've been working in sports integrity for almost as long as that. But some of the milestones that we have achieved in combating bad things in sport has not been because of ourselves, we have to say, but it has been because of investigative journalists. The hard work and dedication from these guys under often very difficult circumstances have been moving us forward in many ways. And one of the foremost examples of investigative journalism in sport is Mr. Jens Weinreich from Germany. Jens is well known to many of you who have attended these conferences before, and he will speak to us again now about what we could say Olympic crime, which is quite a wide subject. But Jens, you're welcome, please.
Good morning, big task, 10 minutes. I don't know if I can match it. You will give me the red card maybe. So Arnout was finishing his presentation mentioning weaknesses in the so-called good governance environment. I would like to talk a little bit about these weaknesses, and when I say that, I have deleted my presentation. No, I found it again, thanks to Apple. So, today's stars will coming soon. It is really an honor this time for me to sit on a podium later on with Fabiana and Jean-Yves, with two outstanding prosecutors from Brazil and France. As you all know, this is a historical situation. Never before in the Olympic history any prosecution authority would have acted like this. And the combination of all the ongoing investigations in Brazil, in France, in Switzerland, in the US, and many other countries have created big fear in the Olympic movement, sometimes panic, partly chaos. Maybe Francesco is telling us something about it later on. And you may know, according to criminal scientists from Germany, only 95% of corruption cases will be public. The number of unreported cases is gigantic. Exciting times. I remember the first years of Play the Game when we were attacked by sport officials, by academics, and within the media for using the C word too many times. What do I mean, the C word? Corruption. These days, everyone is talking about corruption, and we do use another C word, crime. Journalists have done their job well, first and foremost my dear friend Andrew Jennings, who has inspired a generation of journalists. But perhaps Andrew and others have made huge mistakes. They always underestimated the level of crime in the movement. This is a matter of fact. I would like to tell you a story. I would like to talk about Olympic reality. I'm going to tell you some facts about the different sorts of rules, and this is one of the biggest problems when talking about good governance in the world of sports. There are rules for ordinary administrators and officials, and some rules for their leaders. There's a huge gap between the administration level and the political leadership in almost all Olympic federations. It's still there. We have heard Hassan Al-Tawadi last night telling us that there was no corruption at all during Qatar's bid for the FIFA World Cup. As I understood this gentleman, if I understood him right, one of the biggest reasons for Qatar's victory has been the fact that Al-Tawadi, who grew up in Spain, was able to communicate in the mother language of one of the biggest gangsters in the history of world football, the late Julio Grondona from Argentina. Al-Tawadi would tell us he does not know what the guys are talking about at the FIFA trial in Brooklyn. Wait and see, maybe, perhaps he will know one day. Perhaps he will remember. Perhaps the prosecutors in Brazil, France, Switzerland, and other countries are going to help him to know and to remember soon. This mafia trial on the basis of the RICO Act, never forget that, let's be very clear, is also an Olympic trial. Not only is FIFA an important part of the so-called Olympic movement and the Olympic Games, not only were defendants involved in Olympic business too. The point is, some of the most powerful and influential officials in the Olympic world are mentioned in DOJ documents. You all can download and read the indictment against Richard Lai from Guam, a US citizen. He pleaded guilty to have accepted bribes not only from Mohammed bin Hammam from Qatar, but also from two officials who are mentioned as co-conspirator number 2 and co-conspirator number 3 in the Lai indictment. Co-conspirator number 2 is Sheikh Ahmed al-Fahad al-Sabah from Kuwait. Kuwait, by the way, is the only of the current 206 NOCs fully suspended by the IOC. But a suspension like this does not affect the positions of Kuwaiti officials. This is another part, what I have said before, of two parts of rules for the political leaders and for athletes and for ordinary administrators. Co-conspirator number 3 is Hussein al-Musallam, the most important aide of the Sheikh. The Sheikh is maybe all of you know, an IOC member. He was not decisive, but he has played an important role in making Thomas Bach the IOC president. He is president of OCA, so to say by birth, because the president before was his father. He is president of ANOC, which is the organization of all national Olympic committees, and he is, I mentioned this later on again, he is responsible for IOC's $500 million development fund called Olympic Solidarity. As usual, Hussein Al-Musallam, by the way, vice president of FINA, World Swimming Association. As usual, both men deny wrongdoing. If you follow the developments within the IOC, ANOC, FINA, FIFA, and OCA, not to mention other organizations, the Sheikh is playing an important role. If you follow these developments after the publication of the Lai indictment, you will surely understand the different levels of good governance and so-called ethic rules and so-called ethics committees and so-called independent investigations in the Olympic movement. By the way, there's only one independent investigation possible, or maybe two, maybe journalists and those guys, the prosecutors. This is everything. Only this counts. Only results, facts, documents. There has never been any independent investigation by ASOIF or ANOC or IOC. This is a joke. This is a lie. This is a birth lie of the system. Again, I'm talking about an indictment, a guilty plea, well-documented bank transfers, and so on. Read the documentation. But according to a ridiculous, farcical, and shameful so-called ethics committee, the allegations of the DOJ and other media investigations regarding the Sheikh and Hussein Al-Musallam are, I quote, fake and fabricated, said the former president of the International Volleyball Federation, FIVB, an official from China, chosen by the Sheikh as his OCA's ethics officer, and instructed by the Sheikh to investigate the case. Investigate? The facts are on the table. Mr. Jean-Yves from China do not care. He says fake and fabricated. It was another farcical moment at OCA's latest Congress in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, when the Chinese ethics expert would praise the co-conspirator number 2, the co-conspirator would then march into the meeting hall and received standing ovations from dozens of IOC members, including current and former members of IOC's executive board and vice presidents, including John Coates from Australia, president of the Court of Arbitration for Sports, CAS, another important ally of the IOC president. Some may remember that John Coates, CAS president, was the man who has paid bribes, so-called development funds, to the African IOC members Francis Nyangweso from Uganda and Charles Mukura from Kenya, only hours before the election of the host city of the Olympic Games 2000. The last night contracts with Nyangweso and Mukura in Monte Carlo were successful. Hours later, Sydney won with 45 to 43 IOC votes against Beijing. And John Coates remained one of the most distinguished IOC members, not only president of the so-called independent CAS, but also chair of the Tokyo 2020 Coordination Commission, among other important positions. I could give you 100 of other examples. You may know that the Sheikh, I told you before, is responsible, and I say it again, for IOC's development fund. Did anything happen after publication of the Lai indictment? No. We witnessed a similar farcical situation at ANOC's General Assembly 3 weeks ago in Prague in the Czech Republic. This time another of the Sheikh puppets, FINA President Julio Maglione from Uruguay, would claim the Sheikh is innocent, without mentioning the DOJ, without mentioning facts, without mentioning the documents, without mentioning anything at all. Maglione became ANOC's honorary vice president a day later and got ANOC's lifetime award handed out by the IOC president a few hours later. Applause, applause in the room. No intervention from delegates from Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, or US officials, or officials from Italy. Only one delegate the day after from the tiny island of St. Lucia would ask questions about the facts of this resolution in favor of the sheikh. The sheikh would answer, "No, we discussed this yesterday." And the guy from St. Lucia would then say, but can we have it in the minutes? I just want to have it filed in the minutes. And when can I read it? What was presented at the EB meeting the day before? And the sheikh would reply something like, "You can read it next year." So this is reality. This is the political leadership. This is reality. Again, Arnout would send a resolution to the world, a resolution of total support for Sheikh Ahmad, the body of the IOC president. Meanwhile, last week, FIFA's ethics committee has banned Richard Ley, the bribe taker in the DOJ case, for life. But what about the bribe payer, the co-conspirators, number 2, number 3? Interesting question. This is a typical question for the movement. They simply don't care. This is reality. This is their good governance at the top level. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens, and there will be time for questions and answers later on. 8 years ago, I was present as one of the national organizers of the IOC session in my hometown of Copenhagen, 2009. And I was impressed by the presentation of the bid team from Rio de Janeiro in the contest of winning the right to organize the 2016 Olympic Games. And there were huge celebrations when Rio made their presentation and finally won this bid and organized the games last year, and everything was fine, or was it? Was there something behind the scenes going on? Some major figures around these Olympic Games seem to be in jail at the moment, and we are very excited that here at the Play the Game we can welcome Mrs. Fabiana Schneider, who is a federal prosecutor from the government of Brazil, who will present us some of the stories about the investigation that is going on in Brazil at the moment. So please, Fabiana, we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. First of all, I would like to dedicate my speech for my friends in Car Wash Task Force in Rio de Janeiro and for my colleagues from the French Ministry here, represented by Monsieur Jean-Yves Lourgouilloux. Well, in 2014, the intensive phase of Car Wash Task Force, Operation Car Wash, started. Ever since, Brazil has been living a tsunami. Day after day, new criminal schemes have been unveiled among the highest positions of our republic. This is the most important operation of the history of Brazil because it reaches corruption in all levels of power. President, senators, deputies, governors, mayors, etc. Besides the political power, Operation Car Wash also reaches the economically powerful. Directors of major state companies in the country are in prison, as well as some CEOs of several large corporations in Brazil. Since then, there were almost 200 preventive detentions and almost 3 billion euros returned to the public funds. It is gigantic corruption scheme styled in Brazil to dominate the most important sectors of the economy and power. In Brazil, 45% of the people, of the population, don't have basic sanitation, water treatment, or sewage system at home. Unfortunately, the incredible Brazilian social inequality encompasses corruption, the rights of minorities, environmental law, and why not, the way that we plan the large sports events. By the way, in August 2016, for 15 days, Rio de Janeiro seemed to be living a dream. The whole planet was looking at Rio de Janeiro. It was actually a very beautiful celebration. But one fundamental question must be made. Did the social inequality increase or decrease it with the Olympics? The Olympics should be a great opportunity to improve the life of the population in general, but not. While the Olympics took place, the Car Wash Task Force in Rio de Janeiro that had recently created worked silently, analyzing emails, bank data, information from open source, amongst the others. The number of corruption cases in car wash involving politicians, companies, and intermediaries in Rio de Janeiro was so astonishing that a specific team had to be organized to stick to that so-called basic rule: follow the money. The first Operation Car Wash in Rio de Janeiro was called Calicut and arrested the then governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro, Sérgio Cabral, as well as several other members of the criminal organization. Soon afterwards, the other phase came along, and little by little, more members of the criminal organization were also taken to prison. In parallel to this, amidst the investigation on doping in sports, our colleagues from the French Ministry verified a possible buying of votes for the choice of Rio as the city to host the Olympic Games. So we set up an international judicial cooperation to connect all the points in this planetary corruption case. That's how we started the works to lead to the operation named Unfair Play, and resulting in the arrest of Mr. Carlos Nussmann, the then president of the Brazilian Olympic Committee. And this is an essential point of this investigation, and of this kind of investigation, the international cooperation. Just like a football or volleyball team that pursues the best results, when it comes to a globalized criminality, public ministries and investigators need to act jointly. And thus, we formed a team with the French Public Ministry. We've exchanged information, evidence, experience, and we powered up our investigation. The hypothesis was that Brazilian politicians, sports executives, and businessmen had negotiated with the president of the then president of the International Association of Athletics Federation, Lamine Diack, and his family, the buying of votes of some African sports executives for the choice of Rio as the host of the 2016 Olympic Games. From this point, it was a giant worldwide hurdle to raise together enough evidence to close the investigation. The countries that comprised this international judicial cooperation were France, the USA, Antigua and Barbuda, England, and Switzerland. Brazilian collaborators plea bargained and supplied information about a company named Matlock, with headquarters in the British Virgin Islands and belonging to a businessman named Arthur Soares, the King Arthur. This guy transferred over $10 million in bribes to Sérgio Cabral, the then governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro, just to benefit from agreements of service rendered to the state. The money from this bribery had been transferred by means of company Matlock in an account at bank located in Lantigua in Barbuda. The breach of bank secrecy revealed that the same company, Matlock, utilizing a banking account located in Miami, made 2 payments to Papa Diak in September 2009. The investigation revealed a surprising sequence of facts, since Rio de Janeiro had been chosen one of the 4 cities candidates to host the Olympic Games of 2016. As from the beginning of 2009, Carlos Nussmann, Leonardo Griner, Sérgio Cabral, and the businessman Arthur Soares started the deals with the Diak's family to buy the votes for Rio de Janeiro to host the Olympic Games of 2016. The investigations discovered messages sent by email from Papa Diak to Carlos Nussmann and Leonardo Griner, demanding the rest of the payments owed to the Senegalese friends. In fact, we found bank transfers from other sponsors to Pamodi Consulting, a Papa Diak's company. The bank transfers can be evidenced in the breach of bank secrecy. See the international plot in place. Russian doping, African sports executives, Caribbean tax havens, French and American banks, Brazilian politicians, sports executives, and businessmen. Follow the money. From then on, there is a long series of investigative and legal procedures that I will not talk about or you will be bored. The fact is, the French-Brazilian line of investigation was thus completed. Old-style corruption, however, using sophisticated tools to launder money and transfer it by means of offshore accounts. Businessmen taking advantage joined these politicians and sports executives to hijack the Olympic Games and use them as a platform to sign new agreements for the benefit of the same people. All of this together, evidence found by Brazil and France, led to Operation Unfair Play. It is part of a bigger operation, the car wash. In this big movie, the planning and execution of the Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro at any cost was one of the best strategies of financial and political capitalization for the criminal organization headed by Sérgio Cabral, the then governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro. It could multiply the possibilities of illicit gains with the realization of construction works and service agreements signed with other members in the organization, always with the payment of substantial amounts of briberies to political agents. In Brazil, no one was asked whether or not they wanted the Olympic Games in the country. All we saw were massive market campaigns selling the dream of those in 15 magical days. Yes, magical, because it seemed like they had fallen from heaven, free of costs to the population, and promising a better life for all. After the event was over, what we have is an environmentally degraded and a gentrified city with 70,000 people displaced, in a broke city. Of course, not only because of the Olympic Games, since it is all caused by a political and economic contest. But yes, we have a city more and more unequal. If we already had one of the worst inequalities on Earth, now it's even bigger. The idea of development this time came in the shape of 5 Olympic rings. Huge investments were made at everyone's expenses for the benefit of a few. The investigations for this reason do not only seek compensatory justice of what was done in the past, but also future forms of organization that can overcome injustice or inequality. Well, the good news is that for the first time, a big sports executive in Brazil was arrested. And he will account for his acts of corruption. Carlos Nussmann is already free. He only stayed 15 days in prison. It may seem little, but the economic and political elite who have committed crimes in Brazil no longer sleep calmly. And here we can include the sports executives. Nussmann is free, but he cannot leave the country. He cannot enter the Brazilian Olympic Committee, and his assets are blocked. This is a great step in terms of accountability. And this shows how much we are gaining maturity in this kind of investigation. It is very hard to avoid corruption crimes, especially those at the levels found in Brazil. But the investigations, the prisons, and the penalties are the tools that we have to minimally reduce these systematic practices. Well, I'm sorry because my English. I once again thank you very, very much for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiana. Thank you very much, Fabiana, and we will continue along the same lines. Before the coffee break, we have one more speaker, and this is Jean-Yves Lourgouilloux, who was already mentioned in Fabiana's speech. He has been looking very much, as we heard, into the investigations that led to the fall of the leadership of the IAAF, of the Dierck family, a couple of years back. Since the IAAF have their headquarters in Monaco, I suppose that is part of the French regime somehow, and when it comes to prosecution. Jean-Yves is the Deputy Financial Prosecutor of the National Finance Prosecution Office in Paris, France, and he will speak to us about his investigations that was also in cooperation with Brazil. Please, Jean-Yves.
Thank you. It's a great honor and also a great opportunity for me to talk before such an impressive assistant, especially with such good speeches and with a referee in my back. But I would like to congratulate first the organization, except for one point. They didn't apply the Article 24 of the Olympic Charter, making French one of the two official languages. So I will have to talk in English, but if I don't answer to your question in a few minutes, please be sure it won't be because I try to avoid them, but just because I probably won't understand them, or maybe pretending. So I have 12 minutes now to talk about my subject, international investigation in sport, the hurdles for the prosecutor. Of course, if I had a little more time, I would have had also the opportunity to give you some updated news about the criminal investigation ongoing, some exclusive and relevant information on them, but anyway, I've got 10 minutes. So the point is, how is it difficult to be a prosecutor dealing with international corruption case in sport? I will start with some French words, plus loin, plus haut, plus fort. This is obviously the Olympic motto, but also the one of the prosecution service I belong to. This service is Parquet National Financier, also called PNF, also called French prosecutors in the newspaper or conferences. It could be translated as National Financial Prosecution Service. We have been created in 2014 in France. Our creation was a revolution. For the first time, a prosecution unit having a national jurisdiction dealing with the most complex and sensitive financial crime. For the first time, it was created in France. Logically, corruption is one of our main subjects of interest, like fraud tax or money laundering. Doping, sometimes when doping is linked to corruption. domestic corruption, but also international corruption as far as France or French citizens are concerned. So when we started, we had to deal with old cases, old and sometimes cold cases, already open, but we also had the opportunity to work on new cases and even to explore new fields of competence. Our second motto is where there is money, there is corruption, and where there is a lot of money, there is a lot of corruption. So as a kind of evidence, some of my colleagues and myself decided to investigate the marvelous world of business in sport. Everybody was talking about corruption in sport organization. Journalists didn't stop to discover evidence of corruption, and then what happened? Nothing or almost nothing. Rumors or real financial crimes? The only way to know was to check. Why? Just because all kinds of financial crimes need to be punished, of course, but also because who else than justice could pretend to put an end to that kind of corruption? How could one expect that international sport organization would do the job when some of their members are corrupted themselves? When we started, we were very far to believe that we would find such a critical situation, and it is very far to be finished. You can trust me. So we were on the starting line, and we started from nothing. We are now dealing with about 20 criminal cases. Some of them are major cases. Suspected corruption in IAAF about cover-up of doping in Russia. Suspected corruption in IAAF about the choice of athletics World Championships cities. Suspected corruption in IOC about the choice of Olympic Games cities. Suspected corruption in FIFA about about Football World Cup countries. One of the main questions we had to answer was, is it possible to be elected for the organization of a major sport competition without corrupting voters? We are starting to guess the answer. The World Cup is political, I've heard. Olympic Games are political, I've heard. But political is often a way to say corrupted. A little bit cooked. That was what Barack Obama said in his last interview as President of the United States about Copenhagen vote in October 29 for 2016 Olympic Games. Why little bit? These events are above all a good way to make huge amount of money with public fund, of course. And that means that all the ways are available to win. Once, I asked a senior police officer, I asked him, quelle est la différence entre lobbying et corruption? What is the difference between lobbying and corruption? And he replied, c'est pareil. Lobbying, c'est le mot anglais pour corruption. It is the same. Lobbying, it's the English word for corruption. So, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, $22 million paid to influence members, to voters, to their close parents. Is that lobbying? And if it's lobbying, why do you use shell companies, intermediate people, offshore bank accounts? And what is the problem? Even if one day somebody tries to investigate on it, you will first say it is rumors, and then we didn't know, and at the end of the day, you will never lose what you won thanks to corruption. The other competitors will never say anything, maybe because they were corrupted as well, and maybe also because they know you have to keep silent if you want to win one day. Tokyo lost 2016. Tokyo won 2020. Tokyo were able to secure some really heavyweight influential votes. To me, that was the key. Once you secure those big leaders, those influential voters within the IOC, then things start going your way quite quickly. Who is talking? It's not me. It is one of the responsible men who worked for Tokyo Bid. How do you think that you can secure the heavyweight influential votes? I am not talking about rumors. I'm talking about amounts, about offshore banks accounts, about shell companies, about witnesses. I'm talking about people dismissed, arrested, charged. I'm talking about people even convinced. So we started from almost nothing, and we made quick steps in few years through IAAF, IOC, and FIFA case. But it was not an easy job. First of all, when you are a prosecutor, you need to be supported by your hierarchy and not to be entrapped by political pressure. Because, as everybody knows, all this matter is close to politics. You all know that heavyweight international sport organization members or presidents have quite the same rank than a president of a state. Often they are friends, they have dinner together, and they give medals to each other. So impossible to work on it if the justice is not completely independent. And that was the case for us. I have always been supported by my boss, Eliane Oulet, who some of you may already know, and how many times have we all listened about journalist work? It is all rubbish. It is rumors. And how many times have we discovered later that it was not? We couldn't even started some of our major cases without the previous work of independent journalists. And I put the stress on the word independent. No IAAF case and even IOC case without ARD and Ajo Sepelt. And without WADA as well, but thanks to ARD work first. No FIFA case without Sunday Times or France Football. We wouldn't be able to work on 2018 or 2022 World Cup without it. Yesterday, I put my hand up because I read The Ugly Games, wrote by Heidi Blake and Jonathan Calvert, in French version, of course. I found it was an impressive work, very, very interesting and very, very well documented. But what do we do when we have this kind of information? It's quite easy. We check. And guess what? Most of the time, it is confirmed. Whistleblowers are also very important. We do really need to protect them, just because most of the time they put their life in danger. And please, members of International Sport Federation, when you receive the letter from an athlete talking about corruption in her sport at a high level, just don't send the letter to the president of the sport federation of her country. What happened? The athlete quickly wrote another letter saying she was lying. And we discovered a few years later that she was, if you want to cover it up. There are some people very used to that kind of situation called prosecutors. Don't hesitate to tell them. And if you can find a link with France or French citizen, just call me. Another obstacle is about the lack of efficient criminal law. In France, we can easily work on criminal cases with private corruption and money laundering offenses. But you must know that in some countries like Japan or Brazil, private corruption is not even an offense. In Switzerland, it is quite newly an offense. So it's sometimes difficult to cooperate with this country because they could reply it is not an offense in their own country. Another major obstacle is the complexity of the case. Most of the time, bribes are not directly paid by bid committees, but by intermediate people, business most often, using a lot of shell company with bank accounts in offshore countries. We are quite used to this kind of work, but that means you need more and more mutual assistance with countries which sometimes doesn't want to cooperate or only pretend to cooperate. In that matter, the international cooperation we had with Brazil was just perfect. And it was easier to work with my Brazilian colleagues than sometimes with my French one. The worst experience in that matter is, of course, Senegal. This country clearly explained us that they would not cooperate with us. I wonder why. One of our enemies is time as well. And all these inquiries need a lot of time because they are complex and involve several countries. And this time is clearly not compatible with sport organization ethical procedure. So we should find a system which could make possible to share information for the benefit of all. But the most serious obstacle to overcome is doubtless lack of human means of investigation. One day, a journalist asked me if there was a political pressure on a major case we had because he thought that the investigation was going slowly. As a reply, I asked him, "Do you know how many investigators are working on this case in France?" 1, and he has 4 other cases like this to work on. That is clearly the main problem. But even if it takes time, at the end, we usually have the answer to our questions. It's just a question of time and determination. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We are still in the middle of this session, but thanks, and it's a huge credit to our speakers. We are exactly on time for the coffee break. This means we will also start after the coffee break exactly on time, which is 10:35 sharp. So please join us again in 20 minutes and enjoy your coffee. And then we will have all the speakers up at the end for the questions, so you can also prepare your questions for the questions and answers session. Thank you, and thank you very much, Jean-Yves.
Amen.
Please, please, please. Hello again, everybody. Please take your seats. We are about ready to continue this session. We will have another 2 speakers, and then we will have the panel. All speakers will join us at the panel, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Somebody who does not need so much introduction, since he's very well known by most of you. 13 years as Director General of the World Anti-Doping WADA, and finished his job there last year, and was quickly picked up by the IAAF to be head of the new Athletics Integrity Unit. And this is a new unit that has been established after the cases of corruption and crime that we just heard about from Jean-Yves. And David will tell us how a sports organization can act in the face of crime and corruption. We heard previously Arnout's recommendation to international federations. Now we will hear from David Howman how, in practice, the IAAF has reacted to that challenge. Please, David.
Thank you, Jesper. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Friends and colleagues, it's a particular pleasure for me to be back at Play the Game. And I give a hearty thanks to Jens and Maria in particular, but all the team for putting on a very fantastic conference with a great lineup of speakers. You all know that I'm not a member of the IAAF, so I'm not standing here speaking for the IAAF. I'm standing here speaking as a newly appointed chair of the Athletics Integrity Unit, which was formed by the IAAF. And it was formed because of the program that was showed in December 2014, which you all know about and we've heard about a lot, produced by ARD, which exposed an extraordinary story of graft and corruption in the sport of athletics, emanating principally from information given by whistleblowers out of Russia. The allegations of bribery and cover-up shocked the world. The World Anti-Doping Agency reacted by using new powers of investigation that came into being on the 1st of January 2015 and appointed the Pound Commission, a 3-person independent commission, Richard Pound, Richard McLaren and Gunther Junger, to investigate it. When that commission first reported in October 2015 and then later in January 2016, I would suggest that the contents were sensational yet disturbing. For example, high-ranking officials in the International Association of Athletics Federations and the All-Russian Athletics Federation had allegedly sought large payments from Russian athletes in response for a promise to cover up anti-doping rule violations and accordingly to allow athletes to continue to compete in global track and field events, including in particular the Olympic Games in London in 2012. The second report evidenced an informal, illegitimate governance structure operating under the aegis of the IAAF. An informal, illegitimate government structure. Corruption and extortion performed by this group, and the Commission passed on the information to Interpol and to the French police, and you've heard this morning from the prosecutor. Arrested and charged were the former president of the IAAF, Lamine Diack, former IOC member, his special legal counsel, Habib Sissay, and the head of the IAAF anti-doping department, Dr. Gabriel Dole. A warrant for the arrest of Papa Masata Diak was issued by the French authorities. It still is to be executed as he remains in his home country where he cannot be extradited. As an aside, of course, but it's very important for this presentation, the New York Times published an article in May 2016 reporting information given to that paper by the director of the Moscow anti-doping laboratory, Grigory Rodchenkov, alleging that a doping scheme had been initiated in Russia to secure success at the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi 2014. That is when Richard McLaren was asked to undertake an independent person inquiry into the allegations, and of course his consequent reports have led to further implications. Returning then to athletics, it would be fair to say that the IAAF was facing crime and corruption of a sort not previously exposed in any sport. Now, I pause here. You might say FIFA was also confronting a similar scenario. I'm just leaving FIFA to one side for the purpose of this presentation. So what did it do in response? First thing it did, it suspended the Russian Federation from membership of the IAAF. You will have read the media yesterday where that suspension has been continued by the IAAF Council because the terms of the inquiry, which is being headed up by Rune Andersen, a former colleague of mine, has yet to say the Federation has delivered on its roadmap. And I would suggest that it will still work while WADA has not declared RUSADA to be compliant. So the appointment of the task force, the one I mentioned, headed by Rune Andersen, was the second step. The third step, and although it was on the president of the IAAF's agenda prior to the crisis, it immediately took steps to conduct a full root and branch review of its finances and operating systems, and established a working group to undertake a review of all the governance and integrity structures, rules and processes. Within 9 months, quite a quick time, 9 months following an extensive consultation and drafting exercise, the reform recommended over 200 changes. It culminated in a brand new constitution for the IAAF, which incorporated major reform of its governance structures, including the establishment of the Athletics Integrity Unit, the AIU. This is a standalone organisation funded by the IAAF, but responsible for investigating and prosecuting all integrity breaches. All integrity breaches, and I'll come to those in a minute. Driven by a very committed President, Sebastian Coe, this concept was accepted by the full membership of the IAAF, and rules were written to give effect to its mandate. The basic remit of the AIU is to enforce the new Integrity Code of Conduct, which specifies the standards expected of IAAF officials and international level athletes. This code replaced the former Code of Ethics. So this is a new approach by an international federation. Most of the other federations still operate under a, quote, Code of Ethics. The code that the IAAF has put in place and under which mandate we operate covers the following. 1. Results manipulation, otherwise called match fixing or event fixing. 2. Age manipulation. Many cases over the years of athletes putting the wrong age in terms of their documentation, whether that's been done intentionally or because they come from a country where births are not recorded, is something that needs to be inquired into. 3. Transfers of national allegiance, where people transfer from country to country for the purpose of competing in the world of athletics. 4. Bribery and corruption. 5. Illegal betting. 6. Extortion. 7. Anti-doping. 8. Ethics requirements such as gifts, conflicts of interest, improper benefits. And the last one, all other rule breaches other than those that might occur on the field of play. Now that's the first time any sport has given an independent body the right to undertake such an exhaustive agenda. The membership accepted that the trust in the sport was at an all-time low, and not only was there a need to address the issues with such an independent body, it was also important that there be no real or perceptive interference with the operations and workings of the AIU. My position and the position of the members of the board, we were all appointed following an extensive vetting process created by a newly created vetting panel made up of people also independent experts. That was to ensure that all the individuals appointed to the first board were people of integrity, ensuring that there were no conflicts of interest pertaining for any one of us. We as a board have now appointed the first CEO of the unit, Brett Clothier, who has an extensive background in integrity matters with the Australian Football League in Australia. And he and his team have got down to business quickly. Many anti-doping cases have been prosecuted after the Russian fraud was exposed. Appeals have been successfully defended before CAS. And now, we are the first body that's prosecuted cases based on the McLaren evidence. Based on the McLaren evidence, circumstantial evidence, but such that we were able to show to the court there was sufficient information to allow sanctions to be imposed on athletes. The only federation to have done this. Frankie Fredericks, a member of the IAAF Council and an IOC member, has been dealt with by way of provisional suspension by the newly created disciplinary tribunal emanating from the French prosecution we heard about this morning. Russian athletes were able to compete in the IAAF World Championships in London in August 2017, provided they could satisfy certain criteria to indicate they were, quote, clean athletes, unquote. More than 120 applied and several were allowed. Many who were not appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, but none were successful. So you might say that that was a good idea and a good program that was run to ensure that those who could satisfy the criteria were able to compete under a neutral flag. Now the AIU is developing its strategic plan. We're creating an IT program to interface across all investigations, cases and data, advancing our capacity with the hiring of pivotal operational experts, advancing a liaison with athletes, and very importantly, and developing educational programs to broadcast our mandate to all. We must make sure that all athletes, officials and members of the entourage are fully aware of their responsibilities. These are early days. We only started in April this year, but progress has been significant. And I would like to suggest that it is a model that other federations might usefully follow. We are at a time here in 2017 where I would suggest to you the situation confronting world sport is more chaotic, more necessary to have matters addressed than it was in 1998, 1999 when WADA was formed. So it's a pretty good time now to look at ways and means of dealing with all matters of integrity. And I leave that to this conference to debate and discuss over the next few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And David will be joining us at the podium. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing this session's last speaker. It's one of the most distinguished and experienced sports leaders in the world, you could say. Mr. Francesco Ricci Bitti is the president of ASOIF, the Association of Summer Olympic Federations, but he's also a member of WADA's Executive Committee and Foundation Board. and among many other things, the former president of the International Tennis Federation and the IOC. And Mr. Ricci Bitti will speak to us about to what extent federations can be able to regulate themselves. Please, Francesco.
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to be here. I start my career as a Philips engineer, so in this city, so I'm very happy to be here after around 50 years, so that means I'm very old. Having said that, I would like to say, which is my feeling. I am used, due to my long experience, long staying in service, I'm used to speak in front of this kind of conference, at least 2 or 3 times a year, and my feeling is that I feel a very sick man, surrounded by a lot of very good doctors. And my first appreciation goes to these doctors. I have the privilege, as the presenter said, that I'm also on the side of the doctor. I'm a member of the executive board of WADA. I was the founder of the Tennis Integrity Unit, so I was also on the side of the doctor. So clearly we need to improve in sport, we need to be better. But there was also a Latin say that everybody could be a doctor of himself. And this is the approach and the answer to the question that was put in front of me by the organizer of this conference, self-regulation. So our approach is self-regulation with external support. And this was, we follow, and we, in ASOIF, when in 2015, we created the governance task force to be ready to do something really serious and concrete in front of many talks that were going around the new world, the new trend, governance. Governance, for people that has done 35 years of top business experience, it is a word that comes from the corporate world. But the first consideration, we try to understand what was applicable to the sport world. And the differences are huge. Governance could not be in sport blindly apply what is in the corporate for a difference of many differences. The first one, that we have different stakeholders, different accountability, different characteristics. We are a non-for-profit organization, basically the international federation, and the difference between, the spread between the different federations. How can you ask the same kind of effort to a federation like FIFA, where the contribution, I mentioned the parameter that is very familiar to us, that is, for instance, the contribution from the Olympic Games to the international, to the 28th Olympic International Federation, and the Canoe Federation, where this contribution represents 95% of their revenue, and in FIFA, where it is the 0.001. So obviously, there is a gap. You have to be flexible, and you have to adjust yourself. So the main reason why we entertain and we start this project, that now is at the beginning, is the end of the first phase is finished, and we are at the beginning of the second phase, was in 3 points. One, I believe sport deserves the autonomy that enjoy. And I don't want to expand this discussion because the autonomies, there are many autonomies. I only believe in the functional one, the one that relate to the sport rules and to the sport organization. We have to deserve this autonomy that is traditional. The second one is that we have to be accountable to our stakeholder that goes from our member nation to the great public, to the general public, because sport is so relevant in the society now that you cannot identify few stakeholders like in the corporate world. And the third point that never mentioned, to protect our people. Sport is coming from a volunteer basis. Don't forget that always. We always talk about sport as a business. Sport as a business is the top of the pyramid, but sport is based on a voluntary people. And we have to protect them. Only with good governance, these people in a much growing, complex environment could be protected in their activity. So this was the reason we start, and we put in place our governance task force in 2015. These are our federation involved. Now we had 5 new members of the family, the people that are allowed to be in Tokyo as experimental sport. We fix five principles. We create our reference. Each exercise of governance need a reference. I don't like to talk about code, because code was right in WADA, where it was a top-down approach. But here, where we have to be very flexible, I believe I prefer to call reference point. And these were 50 indicator and 5 principle. We developed a questionnaire, and surprisingly, our federation all answered very positively and very fast in time. We had then individual meeting with external support, as I said, not only our people, but people from external organization, consultant. They met the federation individually, and this was the outcome of the end of the first phase of the results we presented already a few months ago. And I like to say that you see the difference. There are 3 groups of federation. They are not mentioned, obviously. We are an association, and each federation knows where it is, but we don't publish the situation. This is, for the moment at least, this is the outcome. And you see from a top of 180 where the federation, the spread is very big, and there is a lot to do. And then we did some general evaluation that I share with you because it could be interesting. And the federation were very good in transparency, more or less. If you go back to the spider, transparency, less in other of the 5 principles that we fixed, that put in front of ourselves. So the conclusion are a good scoring for transparency. You see how many, some consideration that I leave for your, but in general, a good in integrity. It was the lowest scoring in terms of, so there is a lot to do, and we are very happy that some federations, some big federation has taken the horn, like the IAAF. You heard a very good report from David about what IAAF is doing, but there are big activity also in other federations. So this is a general comment about integrity, democracy. You see the difference, but it was very interesting to find a lot of difference between the federation. You see only, for instance, the AGM, and we always recommend to favor yearly AGM, even if it's expensive, because it's a moment of control, a moment of check. And so this is, again, if you move to development solidarity, that is a very important point, because it represents the nature of the international federations that are non-for-profit organizations. So the income has to be redistributed. We are not promoted. And so this is very important also. And we have to do many steps again to be better. You see, and then the control mechanism that was medium. Our judgment was medium, and this is just a very important consideration after 1 year of hard work with all our members. And this is obviously, for instance, this is a consideration. It looks that the International Federation with limit of terms, I am a great fan of the limit of terms, and I had some problem even within the IOC for that reason, because it's not so popular in the Olympic culture. You see the federation with the limit of terms are normally better than the other one in general, because this is just a specific consideration for you. And the conclusion, as I said, that it was a very good exercise after the first period of work. There is a lot to do, and we believe that we have a good picture now to progress and to go forward. So the action that we, first of all, we convinced our friends from Winter to do the same exercise. They follow us 1 year later, and they are doing the same, exactly on the same track, and they are very important. Some of them are very important federation. And the last decision, and I'm close to end my intervention, is that the governance task force last month has decided for the second phase to institute and to create a governance monitoring unit permanently that will act not on compliance, because as I said, due to the variety of actors that we have to take care, compliance perhaps is a word too strong. We don't have a code. We have a standard of reference, but we don't have really a code. So we will work the governance task force on compliance or explain. So we will obviously start interacting with the federation. We will distribute, we adjust the questionnaire, we distribute the second time the questionnaire, and we see already improvement. Already in this period of time, 1 year, many federations has done, obviously the easiest one, improvement in their governance, because the spirit of emulation also play a good role, and we are very satisfied of that. But the governance monitoring unit will work, as I said, on compliance or explain. So we ask why, we try to convince with corrective action, recommended corrective action. This will be basically the second phase, and it is starting now. And then at the end of the second phase, we will decide what to do. As you know, we have to remember that our leverage is not so strong. We are an association, and the only leverage is the money that the IOC distribute, but it's not in our hand, it's basically in the IOC hand. So we are discussing also with the IOC to involve at this stage the IOC, and to see to be prepared for the third and the last phase, I believe. And my ideal is to leave this association at the end of the third phase with a much better governance than I found when I started my presidency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and I will now ask the speakers to join me at the panel here, and we will have the questions and answers session, and while the speakers will come up here, I'd like to tell you a little story. For 25 years, I have been and still am the prosecutor of doping cases in Denmark, and for 16 of those years, I was also the chef de mission for the Danish Olympic team. And in 2008 in Beijing, I was already in the Olympic Village when I got the message that one of my Olympic athletes was tested positive with EPO. And I had to sit in the Olympic Village writing the statement of prosecuting this athlete who was a member of my own Olympic team. Did I think for just one moment that I was in any kind of conflict of interest? Certainly not. Would I think otherwise today? Probably. Because one of the questions that we have, one of the key questions is that, is there automatically a conflict of interest between promoting sport and policing sport? Do we need totally independent units? Is independence possible? We heard strong statements yesterday from Travis Tygart, who was very firm on the independency, whereas Dick Pound had a more nuanced reflection on that matter. Who can regulate the regulators? Should WADA, like the Athletics Integrity Unit, have a broader mandate than just anti-doping to deal with other issues such as corruption, match fixing, manipulation, other sexual harassment, even other integrity issues? This would be the first question, if somebody from the panel would like to address some of those questions, and then I will take questions from the floor. We have microphones for the panelists. And Jens, would you like to start?
Conflict of interest. I would like to add a few points. Yes. This is still one of the most important problems in the movement. You can see it every day. There's an, I would say, institutional conflict of interest. Give you only one example, and more is not necessary, I think. I'm talking about two IOC members, Angela Rogero and Tony Estanguet. Both are athletes in the Athletes Commission, elected IOC members. Rogero is speaker, or chair of Athletes Commission. Both were Olympic bidders. Rogero was even paid by LA 24 and then LA 28, paid through a company, through her own company. Estanguet was, I think, vice CEO of the bidding committee, and now it's discussed in France how much money he will able to get as a CEO of the Olympic Organizing Committee. I think there was a number in the media, more than 1 million. So don't forget, he's still an IOC member, and he's sitting, this is very important, then we come to the Russia discussion, and he is sitting in the disciplinary commission, deciding alongside with Juan Antonio Samaranch Jr. and Dennis Oswald, deciding about the Russian cases. Additionally, my last point is, when Becky Scott, WADA's athlete speaker, was criticizing the developments in the Russian case in summer, Rogero and Estanguet, then Olympic bidders, were very fast to criticize Scott, the critic. So this is institutional conflict of interest, but it is not to be seen. I don't know who in the IOC is thinking about that and who sees that as a problem.
Thank you, Jens. Other comments? I know David, maybe?
I'm not speaking here for the AIU, I'm speaking personally. I believe in all areas relating to breaches of integrity, including the matters that Jens has just talked about, it is far better for anyone under scrutiny to be investigated by a group or a tribunal which has no conflict of interest. And I would prefer to talk about it in those terms rather than independent, because everybody is dependent on something. So no conflict of interest, tribunals or investigators looking at breaches of integrity, which covers a vast area of misbehaviour, has to be the best way to go ahead for the benefit of all. And I'm talking not just about the officials who might be under scrutiny, but the athletes who have to practice sport with those people governing them, and the public who have to watch sport. They would all prefer, in my view, a tribunal set up in that fashion.
No, I'm not speaking like David. I speak on personal. I don't represent anybody here. And I think there is a little bit witch hunting in this kind of discussion about, for instance, I'm very famous within the IOC environment because I don't like the word independence, because it's not existing. I was a businessman for 35 years, and I can tell you that if the independence word is not accompanied by another word, relative independence, then it's not so meaningful. It's just a dream, because when you appoint something. I have to say to my friend that the sport also, unfortunately, or fortunately, I mean fortunately, because the people that know what to talk about in general, is based on representation. So there is a physiological conflict of interest in each sport organization, because we represent, being sport people, we all represent something. We start representing, I was a tennis player, not so good like Federer, but I was a tennis player. And then I became an administrator in a club, in a national federation. I did all regional federation and international federation, and then I was IOC member. When you do one of these jobs, you always represent something. Otherwise, you would not be there, because this is a track to go. So this is physiological. So if you, what I strongly support of the statement of our friend here is the separation of interests. Somebody should not be involved when there is a clear interference in a decision. So you mean, and this has to be chosen case by case, but to make a crusade about that is totally wrong in sport, because it's not feasible. Sport is based on representation, I want to remind that. So we have to be careful, case by case, not to be involved, and it's our ethical behavior, and some rules should help us. But in general, you cannot make a crusade against this problem.
Should we take some questions from the floor? There's already a few. I start clockwise here, please, in the front.
Yes. Yeah, Andy Brown from the Sports Integrity Initiative. I want to talk to you about presidential elections. Now, we know that turkeys don't vote for Christmas, but they do like being fattened up, okay? Now, Blatter largely won his elections on promising money to Africa. Sebco promised 100,000 to each of the 214 IAAF member associations when he was elected. Infantino promised to increase the development budget to 1.2 billion to support his election, okay? And we've heard today the Parquet National Financier of France said that lobbying is the English word for bribes. This is a form of bribery in terms of presidential elections. And isn't it about time that sport took some action in this area to stop people being elected on the back of promising people money?
Does anybody from the panel have any comments to Andy's question? Please.
You need a kind of integrity unit for development funds as well. That is important. It is not acceptable to be, as I mentioned, the Sheikh case in IOC development funds, Olympic solidarity, similar to FIFA, similar to the few very rich organizations, but almost all summer organizations, they do have a kind of development fund. And it comes to special organizations like fencing, led by a Russian billionaire, and this, or judo, and a judo fund also shared by another Russian billionaire. So that has to be totally independent bodies.
I think that it's a very complicated question, because anyone running for any office has to have a platform to work from, and that is probably a strategic plan as to where they're going to take the organisation in the future. That then is delivered to the membership, and one of the structural issues you have to look at, which I think has become very notable in the example of FIFA, is where you have one country, one vote, and you have participants in maybe two countries who outnumber participants in 140. And so you have a different way of, I hate to use the word lobbying, I think it's more electioneering, campaigning, where you are telling your membership how you're going to deliver to them. And so you might be better, before you start to criticise, to look at the structural governance of the Congress that you're speaking with. Tennis has a different approach, and I'm sure Francesco can add to what I've said. But then you've also got to compare it to those who are standing for election in other political spheres, where you get vast promises, and none of those people seem to be charged with any offence.
I support what was said by our journalist friend in terms that there is a risk in the trend that there is interference in what we call, in one of our principles, democracy. And I felt that, so I'm very proud to say that the international federations, that a weighted system of votes is a different one than the democratic one that proved not to be so safe anyhow. In sport, even the democratic one, because it was favoring some choice of lobbying at a lower price than the bigger price. So what I agree, we should really be careful in the future to avoid this kind of distorting factor to the democracy, is to establish code of behavior. I'm very proud that before I left my federation after 16 years of service, long service, I established, and perhaps was the first one, a code of behavior to put all the candidates in the same condition. And this, in my opinion, is the only approach to avoid this kind of, you can call as you want, lobbying. On the other side, as David said, you have to allow the candidate to the position to explain which is their program. So not perhaps with money or with development grant, but to explain the program. But what is important, to put them in the same condition, if possible, as much as you can. And this is something that has to be developed, and I believe is a serious problem, as you mentioned.
Thank you. We take the next question here. Please present yourself and then ask the question.
Yeah, Harry Solberg from Norway, Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Trondheim. It's about corruption. I mean, corruption is not restricted to sport, but I would like to hear maybe from Stefano or who else who might have an opinion. I mean, how is sport in terms of corruption compared to other industry? I've heard arguments that one reason which might be a reason for why sport is to some degree worse is that it's in many countries, in many sports, it's a combination of voluntarism and very short history of being a business, and therefore doesn't have these, let's say, regulations that's other industries actually. So I would like to hear some of you reflect on that issue actually.
Corruption in sports. Stefano, please.
We should say that probably until the beginning of 2000, the decade 2010, crime and the sport was two concepts which were very separate. And then all the scandals pop out, and we suddenly discovered that something was not going well. But basically, what we found in terms of pattern, it's we have facing white collar crime, economic crimes, and I should say that we found some similarities with other environments, and basically what we observe is that we have opportunity for money, especially when we look for example, for public procurement for building new infrastructure when there are Olympic Games or there are mega events that of course attract so many funding. So we have mechanisms that attract investments, and let me say this is not really well regulated in the past. Now sport organizations are paying much more attention to this. So basically there was something that was a bit neglected, but from my point of view there was, let's say, a lot of opportunity that now sporting federation and also states, countries are reducing through regulation and through enforcement. So what I see that in the past sport was not really considered as a field where environment where crime was something related to, and today because of most of the investment money have increased the attention and the size of the market, now there is much more attention and there is a social reaction. So what we observe is that behavior and conducts that in the past were, let's say, tolerated, today are not tolerated anymore. And we can observe similar patterns sometimes with white-collar crime. So I'm not surprised that there is corruption in sport because there are interests. What we should say, what organizations and countries are doing is trying to regulate, to enforce through self-regulation, also through external regulation, this opportunity, and to reduce the fact that this opportunity can generate and can favor criminal conducts.
Of course, partly I totally disagree. Fact is that we should not talk about corruption first. We talk about crime and the Olympic movement. And this is a marriage for more than 30 years, and you all know the reasons and the stories and who has invented what. And there's proof for more than 30 years already. And if you remember the 98-99 so-called IOC crisis and the action plan of the IOC, please remember, it was maybe the most important part of it was that the political task was to avoid investigations worldwide. The committee shared by Dick Pound and including Jacques Roch and Thomas Bach were working on this committee, investigation commission. The committee work was totally focused on Salt Lake City, and at that time you all read the news and facts and documents from all over the world, and it was crucially important for the IOC not to let criminal investigators go into the business. My second point and last point is, it was funny to read when Jean-Yves and Fabiana had their press conference in early September in Rio, when Fabiana was talking about the Olympic system or the Olympic bidding system as a trampoline of corruption. This is exactly the case. The Olympic system is designed to be unaccounted, to be intransparent, and to have the certain business of corruption and even crime. And for prosecutors, and maybe Fabiana and Jean-Yves can talk about that, for prosecutors is very simple, and this is probably lesson number one. Jean-Yves was talking about this. Just follow the money and you have your case. Very simple. But in how many cases prosecutors were able to follow the money in the Olympic world? Maybe in 1% of all cases.
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting question. I don't know about other sectors, but when you look at international sports governance, you see high risks for corruption. Why? Because you have a lot of motives, incentives for corruption. There's a lot of money in this world. There's a lot of power in this world. Where there's money, where there's power, there are incentives for corruption. There is also a lot of undue political interference in this world, political pressure, political instrumentalization. So there's a lot of motives for corruption. These motives will not go away. The money will not go away. The power will not go away. Political interference will not go away. The problem is that you also have opportunity for corruption. If you have bad governance, if you don't have transparency, democracy, accountability implemented in your organizational structure, there is plenty of opportunity for corruption. If you have corrupt cultures in your organization, that people do not regard corruption as something bad, as something immoral, then there is also opportunity for corruption. So I think we cannot make sure that the money goes away. We cannot make sure that political pressure, undue political pressure goes away. What we need to do is minimize opportunity for corruption. And you can only do that by improving organizational cultures and by improving the governance of sport federations.
Thank you.
I just want to say that the world of sport is ripe for the plucking by the criminal underworld. And already the criminals of the world are invading areas of sport and making a lot of money. Making a lot of money because they're hardly under any scrutiny. They can behave in sport in a way that they can't behave in other areas of society, and the sooner we deal with that, the better. If we don't deal with it, it's going to creep and creep and creep and strangle us.
We take a couple more questions. Another comment first? Yes, and then here. Just speak. It's working.
Oh, okay. Just a quick comment. Obviously, there are close links, I think, between, let's say, normal industry fields corruption and sport industry field corruption, because they can work together. If you have a major event, obviously, then after you have to deal with big companies to construct roads, stadium, and so on. So it's a good trampoline, as you said. But I think that there are some differences as well. I work on both fields, so I noticed that most of the time in the, let's say, normal economical industry corruption, the corruption is used for the benefit of the company. For instance, if you want to have a new market in a foreign country, you don't have to, but sometimes they just use corruption to have the new market, and most of the time it's for the company. In the sport industry, usually the corruption is used not for the benefit of the association or obviously the sport, but only for the benefit of their members, the private benefit of their members. And another difference is that in the sport industry, corruption was not sentenced for a long time. So most of the time they feel very confident because there is a feeling of impunity. So for us, and for the moment, it's good because it's easier for prosecutor to find some materials or some evidence. Sometimes it's quite surprising. You can find emails or things very easily, just because it's not already in their culture to be caught or to be investigated. In the normal industry, it's in their culture, so it's more difficult to investigate that kind of fields.
Thank you. We move to short questions and also short answers, if possible. So first was here in the middle.
Yes, Laura Robinson from Canada. You have talked about power and integrity and ethics in sport, and my question to the decision makers within sport and the lawmakers within on the panel is, why have we avoided, when we're talking about all the ways in which crime can occur in sport, we never talk about the sexual abuse and sexual exploitation of athletes, when in fact we know that that too is at epidemic levels. Any people who have a lot of power and younger people who need to find that person with power opens or closes the gate for them is a place that becomes very quickly a rape culture. And I would like to know if we could, from now on, when we're talking about integrity and crime in sport, could we also include sexual assault and sexual exploitation?
I think this is a very serious matter, and I am amazed that only now, but there are people that are acting from a long time. I want to do the example because I have to mention the good things that the sport has done. For instance, in my sport, the welfare policy, because this where the British were calling the general abuse is in the Constitution since 12 years. So people don't know, but some people have done it already much ahead. I agree that we should tackle this matter because sport brings a lot of pressure. I always said that the major responsibility for a sport administrator is not to take care of the top players, the top champions, because they take care of themselves, but of the 99% that they will never achieve to this. We have to be educators. We should not forget that. So a code of abuse, and I'm not talking only about sexual, because this is the worst, but there are many kinds of abuse, and this is the reason my sport was perhaps a pioneer on that, because we had abuse by the parents, by the coaching, and there was abuse, mental abuse, much more than sexual, fortunately, but we tackled this matter 10, 15 years ago. I don't know if you remember Pierre's cases. Many parents in tennis were really very bad example of what abuse means. But basically, the problem is general. I recommend and I support fully what has been required to include one of our governance point indicator is that we need to include rules against the abuse, because we are educators. We very too often forget the all people that gets to sport, and we always remember the top one, the successful one. We need to remember through the successful one that are role model, what happens to them. We need to remember that there are 99% of people that we can ruin them as person, and this is a great responsibility. We should not forget that. Our responsibility is much more general, so I encourage absolutely to include in each rules and constitution of all the organization, national and international, something that at least act as a deterrent to all this kind of abuse, and not only the sexual one.
David, is the subject part of your new Athletics Integrity Unit's work?
It's certainly within the mandate of the AIU. But what I have to say is that you need to work in conjunction with the law enforcement agencies in the countries where these allegations arise, so that you do not interfere with an investigation that's more properly undertaken by law enforcement. And so welcome any issue of bullying and abuse, but make sure you forward it to the people who can actually deal with it.
David gave me the opportunity to add something to what has been said before. I welcome the presence here of some prosecutor, very successful prosecutor in sport, because sport cannot do everything alone. I was confronted with my first experience, perhaps was the first one, the creation of the Tennis Integrity Unit against match fixing. And in 2010, we start this, and we start investing money, and unfortunately, we are one of the few sports that invest money in this. Successfully. I would say that at that time, the first problem that we faced, in fact, was the coordination. We cannot be investigator, we cannot be judiciary power. We can create some intelligence in our organization, some capacity to detect and to act better, but everything has to be done in cooperation. And the main problem, what I discovered myself, studying the problem in 6-7 years ago, was that even in the government side, they need coordination between three agencies: the legislation, the betting operators that are in many countries, and the judiciary, and the police and the law enforcement. So even three agencies for a problem in each country has to be coordinated. So this, you can imagine the challenge, which is much more difficult than you believe, to really to be effective in some field. So welcome to the judiciary power to get involved in sport, because I think the limits that the sport organization has are much bigger than you believe. We have to create the understanding. For instance, I hear a lot corruption this morning, but why you don't stop to the level, to the lower level that in our opinion is the mismanagement? It's already a big problem. We take care of the mismanagement. We are very happy, because it's not always corruption. Sometimes it's only wasting of money. So that means that is another problem for sport and for each organization. Sorry to have added that.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of hands raised, and we are running out of time. We will take the last couple of questions, one after the other, and then leave it to the panel to make the final remarks. So we'll just take 3 or 4 questions, and then I have to close for questions, and then if you want to make your final remarks from the panel. So the first one is over there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is John Cameron from Canada, and I have a question that deals with the mechanism of investigation, and in particular, obstacles to investigation. So you know at mega events, contracts with mega events can buy a lot of influence, and that influence can be an obstacle to investigation. Has anyone on the panel had experience with obstacles from national police forces which have signed contracts with mega events to supply security? Has anybody had experience with national police forces being an obstacle to your investigation? Thank you.
That was one question about obstacles for investigations into sport. Then we take the question from the next to Laura. There was a question. Wait. Oh.
Thank you. My name is Harri Syväsalmi. I used to be known as Harry Syväsalmi. I'm representing the Finnish Center for Integrity in Sports. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the whole morning. It's been very interesting discussions and interventions. And David, my good colleague, look at the ways and means for the future. I think that you, in your Athletics Integrity Unit, has an answer there as well. My organization is another answer. We have our main stakeholders, sorry to say this, I have to explain a little bit before I ask. Main stakeholders are NOC, Paralympic Committee, and the government of Finland. And Francesco, I liked your intervention talking about independent. We are operationally independent, but we are a representative body. But you have to make sure that you are operationally independent. And you said case by case conflict of interest. Now comes my question. Francesco, you are a member of the WADA Executive Committee, as you mentioned yourself, and you are also a member of the board of the Independent Testing Authority. So you are having there a double role, being a regulator and then a service provider. I guess that you will declare your conflict of interest when WADA handles the issue of ITA. This is the question, just to understand that we understand the conflict of interest in the same way. And last remark is that sexual abuse or all the abuse, if Finnish were a world language like English, you could have read all of you today in the main media of Finland and a big article on the sexual abuse by my organization. So I do think this issue has to be, or it would have been nice to have already on the answer of many years ago. But the answer is that you need to have an agency in your country which works together with public authorities, including the prosecutor's office, including the police, including the whole of sports, including the athletes, and when match fixing is concerned with a betting operator. You have models there, believe me. You should also sometimes look from bottom up. Thank you. And there was the one question to Francesco.
Thanks, Harry. And now we take the last question from here, and then we'll have the final remarks from the panel, and then Jens will come with some practical information about what is going to happen next.
I'd like to know from, Tony Hooper's my name, I'd like to know from the panel how many international sports federations have their headquarters in countries which are tax generous, whose transparency is not as good as it should be, and who punish whistleblowers.
A very concrete question. And if you have made a note of the different questions, it may be raised to different members of the panel, but you're all welcome to come with your final remarks. And I can start here. Fabiana, you have something you... It's open. Just speak.
Sim. Well, in Rio, we don't have some problem with the police because all the investigations have been made by the Federal Public Ministry. So we have done all the work in investigations. And days ago, the Federal Police had a change, a director's change. So I don't know if something will change in the future, but until now, it's everything okay in Rio de Janeiro.
Thank you. Jean-Yves?
Just to conclude, I just would like to say that I've heard the term of cooperation, and I think that's the major point if we want to improve the way to fight against crimes and all kind of crimes in sport, not only financial crimes, all kind of crimes, because as you all know, sport is a very specific field. And this cooperation would help to prevent crimes and also to condemn. So I think we have a lot to do in that field. So I'm optimistic. And to reply to the question of Anthony, I know that FIA, I think, Fédération Internationale Automobile, is in Paris. The others, I think, are in Switzerland or Monaco. And I have to fight often with some foreign people trying to convince them that Monaco is not France. Monaco is a country, is an independent country. I don't know where they are in these countries.
Just final remarks about cooperation. Of course, there is a matter of resources. For the national police, sport corruption is one among several priorities that there's not so much resources dedicated. That's why cooperation is very important. Sometimes federation and integrity unit provide and gather evidence and pass the evidence to the law enforcement to support the investigation, because we have to realize that today, for example, Europol, they are dealing with match fixing, but there are, I think, 2-3 police officers dedicated to this topic, because there is a huge set of priorities. So this is something that we should take into account. So cooperation is important because there is always a problem for resources to dedicate it to the activity. Thank you.
I just want, I conclude with giving Francesco a credit, because I tell you, in 2009 at the Olympic Congress in Copenhagen, right after Rio was awarded the Olympic Games, Rio got the Games, I did several video interviews with federation presidents and IOC members, and my question was always the same question. The question was, do we need, similar to WADA, a World Anti-Corruption Agency, an independent agency? Francesco was one of the few officials who said, yes, with my experience in tennis, yes, I think there is a need for it. There was another guy, I think he was the only guy who refused to answer. He was on video, and I asked him, and suddenly he became totally hectic. He was out of control, and he would run away, and before he would run away, he would tell me, oh, listen, I can't answer this question. I have to look in the news. I have to read the newspapers. I don't know what you are talking about. Corruption, corruption, corruption. I cannot answer the question. You can guess who was it? It was Carlos Nuzman.
I would like to conclude by addressing the question about the headquarters of the international federations. If I'm not mistaken, about 70% of the Olympic international sport federations are based in Switzerland. And you are right, they enjoy a large degree of fiscal autonomy, exempt from taxes at the federal level. But perhaps even more importantly, they enjoy a large degree of organizational autonomy. Swiss Civil Code only lists very basic requirements for associations. And until recently, there was limited prosecution of corruption. Of private corruption in Switzerland. So this links to an issue that we haven't addressed at this panel, but which is interesting, I think, and that is the responsibility of the home country, of the headquarters of international sports federations. Of course, international sports federations can make their home base wherever they want. They can open a headquarter wherever they want. They are internationally operating organizations, and in the past they have threatened to reallocate to a different location if Switzerland would increase its organizational requirements or make stricter laws.
I'd just like to conclude by saying a couple of things in relation to headquarters, in relation to the institutions that I've been engaged with. It's very important that WADA made a decision 10 days ago to maintain its headquarters in Montreal in Canada. It would be very important, I think, if integrity units were headquartered in countries of integrity. So I'm going to suggest two things. One, the AIU, which I have the pleasure of chairing at the present, move to New Zealand, or perhaps stay in Denmark, being the two least corrupt countries in the world, and therefore properly set up to stage such headquarters.
I didn't remember. I remember the first question of Ali Salayami that is I answered. I can tell you, Ali, I can reassure you, I feel absolutely comfortable in my two positions. Even if I didn't look for the second one, the recent one, that was I was asked to do this job against my wishes. I feel very comfortable because you, if I am remembering well, it looks to me this a sophisticated Scandinavian way to see the matter, because you should remember, as having been the leader of WADA in the first years, that WADA was created with two shareholders, the IOC or the sport movement and the government, 50-50. And this was the level of control, obviously, the board. So I am in the board as representative of the sport movement. Otherwise, nobody would be in the board if you follow your criteria. The second level, that is the operating level, was the NADO on the side of the domestic control, and the International Federation, this was the beginning of WADA, the International Federation as elite sport control. So this is very different, the two levels of governance, one in each company who pays, has the right to represent who pays in the board, and this is what I do since many years, in the, as you know, in the executive board. Then there is the second level, the operating level, and the operating level is a little bit more delicate, you are right, but with this criteria, any chairman or president of a federation should resign, because the international federations are part now, according to the constitution, of the foundation of WADA, or we change the system, or everybody could not be there. So in ITA, that is a big attempt by the IOC that I encourage. I don't know if it will be successful, but to distanciate a little bit more than it was the sport organization from the results management of the cases in doping, because the ITA is not exactly the international federations themselves, that is something different. Again, the international federation has to be represented by constitution of the foundation, Swiss foundation, that is at the base of this. So somebody has been there, whoever he is, and so according to you, nobody could be there. But unfortunately, the constitution is such that this body has to be represented. So for the moment, but a part of this that is more, as I said, the sophistication, I feel very independent because I feel independent-minded. This is more important than to be independent. You have to represent. All these organizations are based on representation. And I want to spend some word also about this, because I hear only bad things about the sport and so on and so on. For instance, in doping, I lived an experience as president of the International Federation that was significant. Doping is a very difficult task, like integrity. It's a lose-lose situation. Because, you know, in front of the media, if you have many positive cases, you have a problem in the sport. If you don't have case, you don't have a good program. So you'll never get out very well. And I can tell you, I want to spend one word for a federation that I see here, Brian Cookson, the former president of UCI. UCI, without UCI, we would not be scientifically where we are in doping. And UCI has been crucified for 20 years. Obviously, they had some problem. But without them, we would not have developed so early the passport, the biological passport, many scientific progress. So you have also to take the good side of what we are doing. There is not only the bad side. The good side is that many people are working with limited resources, because limited resources, the International Federation are non-for-profit organizations, and except few, they don't have so much money available. They have the money that comes from the Olympic Committee. They have to choose between development, integrity, and so also this is a big consideration that has to be taken for you to go home. We cannot spend huge amount of money, everybody of us, in integrity, because we don't have even the money to develop the games, if we talk about small federations. So, about transparency, okay, well, the 70% is in Switzerland and we have some benefit in terms perhaps of fiscal benefit, but I think this is has to be judged very positive, not in terms of transparency. It has to be judged positive because it's money that return in general to the game.
Thank you.
When it will come, I will take care of it.
Yeah. While Jens is moving up here, the rest will have to be taken in the coffee breaks. I'm sorry, this is a very, very interesting discussion, and we could probably go on for hours, but there's a lot of other interesting things on the topics today. I have promised Fabiana the very last remark, and then we'll thank the panel, and Jens will give you some practical details. Please, Fabiana.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank you again, once again, for having me here. And I'm not any specialty in sports. My area is corruption. But I think it's a good opportunity for the sport changes its procedures and the structure. And for the future, I wish best luck for the next countries that will host next MEG Sports events. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's give the panel a big hand for their contributions.
I would
I would certainly also like to thank the panel. Please don't leave. There are some very important messages. Of course, when they come from the organizers, they are by definition important. First of all, this kind of debate is what in our view as the organizers make it really rewarding to play the game. A very intense, lively debate at a very high professional level where the points of view are clearly marked and providing a lot of insight. So thanks a lot to the panel. Also thanks to the Athletics Integrity Unit for inviting Play the Game to take over hosting it. We will of course welcome to have it in Denmark, but you should know though that Play the Game is actually the only institution in the world that officially lives of sports corruption. Now we are going to Eindhoven. And you will discover that Eindhoven is not one thing, it is at least 5 things. It's maybe even 6 things, because it's a city out there, but it's also the name of all the meeting rooms that you have here down where you have not been yet. So now it's a big logistic exercise to go out to all the interesting sessions that started 4 minutes ago. And the later they really get started, the later you will have your lunch. So you have a strong, now we are talking about incentives, you have a strong incentive to go to these 5 sessions. We have sessions on athletes' rights, we have session on journalism, session about athletes and anti-doping, we have sessions on sports governance here in this room, and we have sessions of mega events. You will find in the program the exact location of this. And one more, and please remember, after lunch at 2:15, you also have to find your way through the Eindhovens of this hotel. There are also, and you have the design saal also in the opposite, just next to this. Last but not least, if you have not registered for the social events, if somehow you did not report when you met our registration people, if you're taking part tonight in the excursion, if you're taking part in the activities tomorrow, if you're taking part in the farewell dinner Wednesday, please go and report, because you risk that there will be no bus and no food for you or no tennis racket or so. That's another incentive. It's a very big difference for us, for organizers, whether we have 250 or 300 people joining these events. So please make sure that your choice is registered. Thank you and enjoy.
Samle lidt sammen på det.